Here is a blue ink by Sailor Studio 943. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A super dark blue that made me wonder for a bit if this was a blue-black or even a very dark purple. But it is blue. Very blue. Now, as the pen gets wetter and broader, the tone does get darker, and it starts as a very dark blue in an extra fine. Because of how dark it is, there is almost no shading. Almost. You'll see a little bit with the extra fine. Considering my disappointment at the last studio ink, this one restored my faith in Sailor, that they didn't just put out tons of these inks with no real consideration and go, yeah, well, those will sell, so we'll put them out. They put out a bunch of nice ones. I use a lot of blue, even though it's not my favorite or preferred color, brown. But I use it a lot because it just goes in most every situation. Normally my blue's much brighter than this, but I wouldn't be upset to have a bottle and use it up. It's a really nice blue. And check out the yellow Rhodia at the end because you're not going to think it's blue then. The pen for today is a Pelikan P200. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice dark blue with no feather, no spread, light spots of shading. Now, I say light spots of shading because if you look at less on the second line, it starts as very dark and then just becomes dark. Or in professional, it does the very dark and dark shift, but it's not a ton really to notice. It is there. It's that it's so dark, a lot of the shading isn't going to come through. Looking at the medium nib is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine and brighter, which, yeah, I'm going to call it a little darker and brighter. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It does give a few moments of shading, just a few moments that are darkest within this. Like in Bilbo, you really do see it stand out quite a bit on the third line. But for the most part, we have a single dark, bright, beautiful blue. Looking at the stub nib, it is by far the darkest tone on the page, much darker than it was with the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is no shading, there's nice, crisp, beautiful lines, great blue. This was where I almost thought this was a very dark purple, though there's not really purple in this ink. Maybe just the tiniest hint of purple in this ink. Not none, but a tiny hint. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, we have no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it's a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still a nice dark blue with no feathering, no spread, Only a few moments of shade, really, like on the second to third line when the Y of yet and the L of could cross. You see it get a little bit darker at that moment, or in the K of back on the fourth line, a little bit darker. It can and almost wants to shade, it's just not really doing it. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. It is just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It has no shading, but it has the vibrancy that was there on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium. It is the same tone as on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading. Very dark, very pronounced, really looking good on the page. This, I think, really does help. There's no blue like this from any kind of rollerball, and it makes what you're writing a little bit nicer. Looking at the back of the page, there's very minor ghosting with how dark this ink is, and nothing bled through and touched the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but the tone of the paper is bringing out a little bit of the purpley color of this ink. It's that slight bit of purple that this has that makes it so dark and rich on the page. No feathering, no spread, no shading going on. It's being eaten up by this more absorbent paper. More absorbent, even though it tends to do very well with fountain pens. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It is a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is showing a little bit of that purplish kind of lean from the tone of this paper. It is giving a little bit of shading. Now, if it only got darker in one or two spots, I would kind of write it off a little bit. But we see it in the K of drinks. We see it in the G of having. We see it in the D of plucked, the D of and. It's showing up enough that I can say that it is shading, just not an incredible amount. But we're not going to get a ton of it here. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine in the darkness of the tone. We still see a little bit of that purple coming through as it's been affected by this paper. Now, we're not getting any feathering or spread or shading, but we are getting a great looking writing on the page. Looking at the back of the page, there's really nothing for ghosting, and nothing bled through and touched the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, not one bit at all. Where the Clairfontaine had a little bit of shading, it is the slight off-white of this paper that it's just not coming through with. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the extra fine and a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feathering, no spread, beautiful crisp letters all the way through if it wasn't for my handwriting, which is what it is. I can read it. Shading is there, and there wasn't a ton on the Clairfontaine, and there's less of it here. When you see squeaked, the K is a bit darker. In it, the T is a bit darker, and I can choose a couple of other letters, but not really shading. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little lighter, just a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. And the slight off-white of this paper lets me see hints of that purple undertone that just shows up every now and then. No feather, no spread, no shade, no problems though, because this looks really good. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Bonnie Elizabeth Parker Steel Blue. Here is Omos Blue. Here is Robert Oster Blue Sea. Here is Zenzoi Blue. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine and a flatter, dustier tone. No feathering, no spread, no shading, but I still think this looks great and easy to read because of how dark it is. Great ink for students to use if it wasn't for the cost. And let's be fair, can you put a cost on a good education? And you definitely can't put a cost on great-looking notes. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Very much a blue. Don't see any of the purple undertones here. Nice flat tone. No feather, no spread, a couple of moments that shading does happen, the G in Wondering on the first line. In Throttled on the second line, you see the H and the TTL get a bit darker. Him starts darker and gets lighter. I'm pleasantly surprised that it is shading here. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's actually a little lighter than the medium on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. Couple moments that shading show up. The stub nib really kind of helped it out there. I think it's shading a little bit more here than it did with the other ones. Again, that stub is really helping it to have a little bit of shading show up from time to time. It's nice when it happens. Kind of a surprise with this paper. Looking at the back of the page, look at how little there is for ghosting. You can easily write back here, despite how completely dark this ink is, and nothing bled through to the other side, because these notebooks should really be looked at by more people.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Sailor Pesh. Here is an orange ink by Monteverde Mandarin Orange. Here is a magenta ink by Roher & Klinger Document Magenta. Here is a yellow ink by Califolio Ochre Juan. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is tiny bits of feathering. You see it in skewer, you see it in burt and picking and wouldn't and make it. It's there. There's a little bit of spread. It's almost a medium. It's almost the exact same width as the medium on the Clairfontaine, so it's a full size up for it. And shading none, which I'm very optimistic then for the back of the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone as the extra fine and still a little lighter, just a tad lighter. Like I said, the extra fine was very close to the medium. This is just a little lighter than the Clairfontaine with no feather. Just kidding. Of course it feathers. It's 20-pound copy paper. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. The spread is not horrible. I don't think it makes it all the way up to a broad. I don't want to use that nib on this paper with this ink. I don't think that's a good choice. I'd stick with the extra fine from what I'm seeing, and we get no shading. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get a lot of feathering. You see it in him a lot. Make on the second line, a lot. Pie, a lot. Said, Bert, here, you. Yes, all feathers, a ton. It does spread. None of this should really be any kind of an issue, but it does show up fairly regularly. Shading, we don't get shading on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see there's plenty of ghosting, and I don't think you could write back here and read your notes comfortably on both sides. It would interfere. But nothing bled through, nothing touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
There's multiple slight variations of tone to choose from, but the medium flow, medium nib is both dark and vibrant, something that's very hard to accomplish. Yet Sailor did it so well here that I can't see putting this ink in any other type of pen. And take a look at how insanely dark this gets on the yellow paper. It really looks like a black. It might be one of the best blacks I've seen. So if you really want a beautiful black, use this in a wet pen on yellow Rhodia.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.